There is a silence in the Japanese countryside that feels heavy, as if the air itself is weighted down by the memories of those who are no longer there. It is a silence that rings in the ears, broken only by the rhythmic creak of a rusting gate or the relentless, scratching whisper of Odzue against a glassless window. If you stand still enough in the heart of the Shikoku Mountains or the deep valleys of Tohoku, you can almost hear the sound of the earth reclaiming what was once hers. It isn't a violent takeover. It is a slow, methodical erasure. Millions of homes stand empty across this archipelago, like hollowed-out shells left behind by a receding tide. They call them akiya, ghost houses. But they aren't just buildings. They are the tombstones of a vanishing way of life. In the time it takes for a single cedar tree to reach its height, entire villages have been swallowed by the green canopy, their names scrubbed from maps and their histories muffled by moss. This is not just a story of migration or economic shifts. It is the story of a nation retreating and a wilderness that has been waiting patiently for centuries to step back over the threshold. To understand how a superpower can begin to vanish from the inside out, you have to look past the neon glow of Shinjuku and the high-speed pulse of the Shinkansen. You have to travel to the places where the trains no longer stop. You have to walk down roads where the asphalt is being cracked open by the silver roots of the forest, and where the only residents left are the ones who are too old to leave, or those who have already passed into the earth. There was a time, not so long ago, when these mountain paths were alive with the sound of human industry. In the decades following the Second World War, Japan was a nation possessed by a singular, frantic energy. The mountains were the lungs of the country. They provided the timber for the reconstruction of the great cities. They provided the coal that fueled the factories. They provided the rice that fed the miracle. Imagine a village in the late 1950s. The morning mist would rise to the sound of shutters being slid open in unison, a rhythmic clatter that signaled the start of the day. The air would smell of wood smoke and pickled radish. In these communities, everyone was a thread in a tightly woven fabric. There were the charcoal burners, their faces etched with the soot of the kilns. There were the terrace farmers, bending their backs to the emerald staircases of the rice paddies. Children in yellow caps would march in lines towards schools that hummed with the chaotic music of youth. These were places of permanence. A family home was not just property, it was a lineage, a physical manifestation of ancestors who had cleared this land by hand, stone by heavy stone. But as the cities grew taller, the mountains seemed to grow steeper. The very success of Japan's urban centers became the poison that would slowly drain the countryside of its blood. It started with the young. The promise of the city, the high wages, the modern comforts, the anonymity of the crowd began to pull at the heartstrings of the post-war generation. One by one, the sons and daughters of the mountains boarded one-way trains to Tokyo, Osaka, and Nagoya. They left with promises to return, to take over the family farm, to care for the ancestral graves. But the city is a jealous master. It consumes time, and it rewrites the soul. Year by year, the average age of the villages began to creep upward. The schools were the first to feel the chill. A classroom built for 40 children soon held 20, then 10, then 5. Eventually, the day would come when the final graduation ceremony was held. A single student, perhaps, standing alone on a wooden stage, receiving a diploma while the elderly villagers watched from the back, their eyes wet with the realization that the future had just walked out the door. When a school closes, the heartbeat of a town skips. When the local store follows, the pulse begins to fade. In many of these places, the decline was so gradual that people didn't notice the tipping point until it had already passed. A house would go dark on the corner, then another. A garden that was once meticulously manicured would sprout a few stray weeds. Then the weeds would become tall grass. Then the vines would appear kudzu, the mile-a-minute vine, draped over the eaves like a green shroud. There is a specific kind of melancholy in an abandoned Japanese home. Unlike the sun-bleached ruins of the American West or the stone husks of Europe, these houses are often left fully furnished. They feel less like ruins and more like stage sets where the actors simply forgot to return. Step inside one of these akiya and you are stepping into a time capsule. On the kitchen table, a ceramic tea set sits waiting for a guest who will never arrive. A calendar on the wall is frozen in a month from 1984. In the corner, a child's backpack lies slumped on the floor, its leather cracked by the humidity of 40 summers. Why was everything left behind? It is one of the great mysteries of the disappearing countryside. In many cases, the owners died alone, the last of their line, leaving no one to claim the artifacts of their lives. In others, the cost of moving furniture through the narrow mountain passes was simply too high. But there is a deeper, more spiritual reason. To many, these houses are still inhabited by the spirits of the past. To disturb the remains of a family home is to disturb the peace of the ancestors. And so, the doors are locked, the curtains are drawn, and the house is surrendered to the elements. But the elements in Japan are not passive. The climate is a humid, relentless force. Without the heat of a human stove to dry the air, the wood begins to soften. The tatami mats made of woven straw begin to rot, emitting a sweet, sickly scent that attracts the insects. The paper doors, the shoji, are the first to go, shredded by the wind or the claws of small animals. Then come the vines. The forest does not wait for the house to fall before it moves in. It begins at the edges. Ferns sprout in the damp corners of the entryway. Ivy snakes through the gaps in the roof tiles. In some houses, trees have been known to grow straight through the floorboards, their branches reaching toward the holes in the ceiling, as if trying to pull the sky down into the living room. It is a slow-motion invasion, a botanical siege that turns a home into a greenhouse, and then, eventually, into a mound of green humps in the landscape. As you walk through these marginal villages, a term used by sociologists to describe communities where more than half the population is over the age of 65, you realize that you are witnessing a biological succession. Humans are being replaced by the wild. Macaques now roam the streets where children once played. Wild boars root through abandoned vegetable patches, no longer fearing the scent of man. In some prefectures, the bears have begun to descend from the high peaks, reclaiming the valleys because there is no longer anyone left to scare them away. But what happens to the people who remain? Those who stayed behind while the world moved on? They are the sentinels of a disappearing world. They live in a strange, twilight reality, surrounded by the ghosts of their neighbors' lives. They watch as the forest inches closer to their own doorsteps, knowing that they are the last line of defense. They spend their days tending to graves that no one else visits and weeding shrines for gods that have been largely forgotten. They are the keepers of a story that is being rewritten by the wind and the rain. Yet, as we look closer at these skeletal remains of the Japanese dream, we find that the disappearance of these towns isn't just a matter of bad luck or shifting demographics. There was a sequence of events, a series of choices made in the halls of power and the boardrooms of industry that sealed the fate of the countryside long before the last light went out. To find the truth, we have to look beneath the moss and the fallen timber at the structural rot that started when Japan was at its most prosperous. We have to ask, was this decline inevitable, or was it a sacrifice made on the altar of progress? The answer lies in the years of the bubble, when the ground beneath the Japanese people began to shift in ways no one saw coming. The 1980s in Japan were a fever dream of neon and gold. It was a time when the land beneath a single square meter of the Ginza district was worth more than a small mountain range in the countryside. The world looked at Japan and saw a machine that would never stop, a financial titan that was buying up the world's landmarks and redefining the future of technology. But while the skyscrapers of Tokyo were reaching for the heavens, the foundations of rural Japan were quietly crumbling. The economic miracle was a centrifugal force, spinning wealth and opportunity into the urban center and flinging everything else to the margin. During these years of excess, the government attempted to bridge the widening gap between the city and the village with concrete. They called it the construction state. Massive amounts of public money were poured into the countryside, but not for schools or healthcare. Instead, they built bridges that led to nowhere, paved riverbeds with grey cement, and carved tunnels through mountains to reach hamlets that were already half empty. It was a desperate attempt to create jobs and keep the rural economy on life support. But you cannot sustain a community with asphalt alone. The infrastructure was modern, but the houses it connected were filling with ghosts. As the economic bubble finally burst in the early 90s, the true scale of the demographic crisis began to emerge from the wreckage. Japan was entering an era of the silver tsunami. It wasn't just that the young had left, it was that the birth rate had plummeted to levels that made replacement impossible. In the deep countryside, the sound of a crying baby became a rarity, then a memory, then a legend. The population didn't just shrink, it aged with a terrifying uniformity. In thousands of villages, the average age climbed past 70, then 80. The forest, ever watchful, seemed to sense this loss of vitality. It began to reclaim the periphery. First, it took the rice paddies. A terrace that is not flooded and tilled every spring quickly becomes a nursery for weeds. Within 3 years, the tall grass takes over. Within 10, the saplings of cedar and cypress have taken root. By 20 years, the carefully sculpted staircase of the mountainside is gone, smoothed over by a chaotic tangle of green. When you fly over Japan today, you can see the shapes of these terraces beneath the trees, like the fossilized ribs of a giant creature, buried under a sea of leaves. But why are these houses left to rot? Why wouldn't a family sell their ancestral home rather than let the forest devour it? This is where the hidden truth becomes a legal and cultural labyrinth. In Japan, land and buildings are often owned separately, and the laws of inheritance are a tangled web. When the head of a household passes away, the property is often split among multiple heirs who have long since moved to the city. To sell the house, every single heir must agree. If one cousin in Osaka can't be found, or if one sibling in Chiba refuses to sign out of a misplaced sense of duty, the house enters a legal purgatory. The tax system only complicates the tragedy. In a strange quirk of Japanese law, land with a building on it is taxed at a much lower rate than empty land. If a family tears down a crumbling house, their property taxes can jump by as much as 6 times. And so, the rational choice is to let the house stand. They leave it to the wind and the rain, waiting for the roof to cave in, waiting for the forest to do what they cannot afford to do themselves. There are currently over 8 million of these IKEA across the country. Some experts predict that by 2033, 1 in every 3 homes in Japan will be abandoned. This is the IKEA problem as seen on a spreadsheet, but the human reality is far more haunting. In many of these disappearing towns, a phenomenon known as kodokushi, the lonely death, has become a silent epidemic. An elderly person, perhaps the last of their friends, passes away in a house at the end of a long, overgrown path. Because there are no neighbours left to notice the lack of movement, or because the closest house is a quarter mile away, they are not found for weeks, months, or even years. The forest becomes their only witness. It grows over the windows, blocking out the light, as if to offer a shroud for the departed. In the village of Nagoro, in the hidden valleys of Shikoku, one woman decided to fight the silence in a way that is both beautiful and deeply unsettling. Ayano Tsukimi returned to her childhood home to find it nearly empty. To fill the void left by the neighbors who had died or moved away, she began to craft life-size dolls. She placed them everywhere, at the bus stop, sitting in the fields, slumped over desks in the abandoned school. There are now hundreds of these dolls, far outnumbering the living residents. From a distance, the village looks inhabited, a vibrant community frozen in time. But as you get closer, you realize the eyes are made of buttons and the skin is made of cloth. It is a haunting physical manifestation of the countryside's grief, a place where the memories of people are being manually kept alive in a world that has moved on. The loss of these towns also means the loss of a specific kind of wisdom. The people of the Japanese countryside were the masters of Satoyama, the borderland between the mountain and the flatland. They knew how to manage the forest so that it provided for them without encroaching on their lives. They knew which mushrooms were safe, how to channel the mountain springs, and how to read the clouds to predict a landslide. As the last of the elders pass away, this library of survival is being burned to the ground. The hidden truth is that when the forest reclaims the countryside, it isn't just reclaiming land, it is erasing a 1,000-year-old dialogue between humanity and nature. But what happens when the forest grows too thick? When the balance is finally tipped? In the absence of human management, the woods are changing. The cedar plantations, once planted for timber that is no longer harvested, have become dark, sterile monocultures. They block out the sun, preventing smaller plants from growing and turning the ground into a muddy slope prone to catastrophic slides during the typhoon season. The wild animals, once kept at bay by the presence of hunters and farmers, are growing bolder. They are no longer just visitors, they are the new landlords. Even as the government tries to lure digital nomads and young families back to the rural areas with the promise of free houses and high-speed internet, the tide is hard to turn. For many, the countryside has become a place of fear, a place of isolation, of failing infrastructure, and of a nature that feels increasingly hostile. But for those who choose to look closer, there is a mystery that remains. Some say that in the heart of these abandoned forests, something else is waking up. Something that existed long before the concrete and the neon. As the human footprint fades, the ancient spirits of the land, the folklore that Japan worked so hard to modernize away, seem to be returning to the empty corridors and the moss-covered shrines. The question is no longer just how many people are leaving, but what exactly is coming back to take their place. There is a subtle, haunting shift in the atmosphere of a village that has passed the point of no return. It's a feeling that the hierarchy of the world has been inverted. For centuries, humans were the masters of this landscape, carving order out of the chaos of the mountain. But walk through an abandoned hamlet in the twilight hours today, and you will feel a distinct sense that you are an intruder. You are a guest in a house that no longer belongs to your kind. The hidden truth isn't just about economics or demographics. It is about the reawakening of a primal force that had been suppressed by the noise of the 20th century. In the old Shinto beliefs, the forest was never just a collection of trees. It was a realm of the kami, the spirits that reside in the rocks, the streams, and the ancient groves. When people lived here, they maintained a delicate treaty with these spirits through ritual and care. They swept the shrine paths and offered rice to the mountain gods. But as the people vanished, the treaty expired. The shrines are now tilted at precarious angles, their vermilion paint peeling like sunburnt skin. The stone fox statues of Inari are decapitated by falling branches or buried in leaf litter. Without the human hand to keep the boundaries, the spirits of the wild have returned to reclaim their territory, and they do not seem interested in sharing it. This is the eerie beauty of Japan's disappearing countryside. It is a glimpse into a post-human world. It is a laboratory where we can watch how quickly the earth heals its scars. We see it in the way the asphalt of the old mountain roads is being pulverized. First come the cracks, then the moss, then the hardy weeds. Within a generation, a road that once carried trucks and buses becomes a narrow hiking trail. Within 2, it is indistinguishable from the forest floor. The forest doesn't just grow over the road, it digests it. It breaks down the chemicals, the stone and the oil, folding them back into the dark, damp soil. But Japan is not alone in this retreat. It is merely the vanguard. From the hollowed-out villages of southern Italy to the shrinking towns of the American Great Plains and the dying industrial hubs of Eastern Europe, the world is beginning to contract. For 200 years, the story of humanity was one of relentless expansion. More people, more cities, more land under the plow. Now, for the first time in modern history, we are seeing the reverse. Japan is the canary in the coal mine, showing the rest of the world what happens when a society stops growing and begins to pull back its borders. It is a slow-motion collapse that looks, from a distance, like a peaceful slumber. Yet, for those who live in the great urban centers of Tokyo or Osaka, this vanishing world is almost invisible. It exists as a half-remembered dream, a place they visit once a year to pay respects to a grandmother or to see the autumn leaves. They see the beauty of the untouched nature, but they rarely see the tragedy of the loss. They don't see the archives of families being eaten by termites. They don't see the local dialects, the folk songs, and the unique regional recipes that are dying with the last few residents of the mountain valleys. Every time a village disappears into the forest, a unique way of being human is extinguished forever. There is a specific moment in the life of an abandoned house that is more poignant than any other. It is the moment the roof finally gives way. In Japanese architecture, the roof is the soul of the building. Its heavy tiles and massive timber beams are designed to withstand earthquakes and typhoons, but they require the constant attention of humans to keep the moisture out. Once the first tile slips, the end is inevitable. The rain enters the attic, soaking the ancient cedar rafters. The wood begins to bow. Then, one night, perhaps during a heavy snowfall or a summer storm, the weight becomes too much. The house groans, a sound like a long-repressed sigh, and the center falls in. When the roof collapses, the distinction between inside and outside vanishes. The forest no longer has to wait at the door, it falls from the sky. Within a few years, the house becomes a mound of earth and splinters. Ferns grow from the remains of the tatami. The family altar, the butsudan, becomes a nesting site for birds. In this final stage, the house has been fully digested. It has returned to the mountain from which its timbers were originally cut. It is a perfect, closed loop of existence. Perhaps there is a strange comfort to be found in this process. We spend our lives building walls to keep the wild at bay. convinced that our structures are permanent. But the forest reclaiming the Japanese countryside reminds us that our presence on this planet is a temporary lease. The Earth is patient. It can afford to wait. It waited through the centuries of feudal lords, through the Industrial Revolution, and through the frantic boom of the bubble years. It is simply taking back what was always its own. As the sun sets over a valley in Nagano or Gifu, the shadows of the trees stretch across the empty streets of towns that were once full of life. You can see the lights of a single house flickering on a lone resident, perhaps in their 90s, preparing a solitary meal. Around them, the forest is a wall of darkness, humming with the sound of 1,000 insects. That single light is a defiance, a small spark of human will in an ocean of encroaching green. But eventually, that light, too, will go out. And when it does, the forest will step over the final threshold. The hidden truth about Japan's empty countryside is that it is not a story of failure, but a story of transition. It is the sound of a nation breathing out. We are witnessing the end of an era of consumption and the beginning of an era of rewilding. It is a landscape of profound sadness, yes, but also one of incredible mystery. It asks us what we value most, the progress of the city or the memory of the soil. In the end, the forest doesn't care about our economies or our heritage. It only cares about the rain, the sun, and the space to grow. As we retreat into our digital worlds and our concrete towers, the mountains of Japan are slowly returning to a state of grace, a wilderness where the wind blows through empty halls and the only music is the sound of the water in the stream. The maps will change, the names will fade, but the land will remain, deep and silent, draped in a thick carpet of moss, cradling the secrets of a civilization that once thought it could conquer the wild, only to be peacefully absorbed back into its heart. The story of the disappearing towns is the story of us all. It is a reminder that we are part of a cycle far larger than our own short lives. And as the trees continue their slow march across the old rice fields and through the abandoned schoolyards, they stand as monuments to a simple, unavoidable truth, that in the end, nature always wins. The forest has come home, and it has brought the silence with it.